The crack of the rifle shot echoed across the dusty main street of Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory, as a bottle exploded against the wooden post where Maria Whitehorse stood frozen, glass shards catching the late afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. The three men on horseback laughed, their voices carrying the cruel edge of men who had forgotten what consequences felt like. "Dance, little squaw," shouted Jake Murdoch, the eldest of the trio, his yellow teeth visible through his scraggly beard as he levered another round into his Winchester. "Let's see if them fancy widow's weeds can move." Maria pressed her back against the hitching post, her black morning dress stark against the weathered wood. Her dark eyes, however, held no fear, only a calculating stillness that the men were too drunk and arrogant to notice. At 23, she had learned to read men like storm clouds on the horizon, and these three carried the promise of violence in every swagger and sneer. The middle man, Buck Travers, spat tobacco juice that landed inches from her worn leather boots. "Heard tell you been refusing to sell that land of yours to Mr. Morrison. That ain't very neighborly, considering you're all alone now that your husband's feeding the worms." The third outlaw, a wiry man called Snake Eyes for the crude tattoo around his left eye, dismounted and approached with the slow, predatory gait of a man who enjoyed cornering prey. "Maybe she needs some convincing, boys. Some personal attention to help her see reason." The few townspeople who had been on the street moments before had vanished like smoke, shuttering their windows and bolting their doors. Willow Creek had learned long ago that Morrison's men operated with impunity, and Sheriff Collins had been in Morrison's pocket since before the railroad came through. Justice in this corner of Wyoming belonged to whoever had the most guns and the least conscience. Maria's fingers found the small leather pouch hanging from her neck, hidden beneath her dress. Inside lay a piece of sacred red clay and a fragment of her father's war lance, items that had traveled with her from the Powder River country to this godforsaken settlement where she had tried to build a new life with Thomas Whitehorse, her late husband. Thomas, a mixed-blood Lakota like herself, had believed they could bridge two worlds, farming the land while honoring the old ways in private. His death from pneumonia 3 months ago had left her truly between worlds, too Indian for the white settlers, yet too removed from tribal life to easily return. "Cat got your tongue, sweetheart?" Snake Eyes reached out to touch her face, and that's when Maria moved. Her hand shot up faster than a striking rattler, catching his wrist in a grip that made him cry out in surprise and pain. For a moment that stretched like taffy, the tableau held, the outlaw bent at an impossible angle, Maria's fingers finding pressure points that her father had taught her before she could properly mount a horse, and the other two men staring in stunned confusion at their companion's distress. "The lady said no," came a voice from the shadows of the general store's overhang. An elderly man stepped into the light, his long gray hair braided in the traditional way, his weathered face bearing the deep lines of 7 decades of Wyoming weather. Joseph Two Eagles had been Thomas's grandfather, and one of the few people in town who knew the full truth of Maria's lineage. Buck Travers swung his pistol toward the old man. "This ain't your concern, grandfather. Unless you want to join your grandson 6 feet under." Joseph smiled, but it was the kind of smile that winter wolves wear when they scent weakness. "My concern is when 3 armed men threaten a woman in broad daylight. My greater concern is when those men are too stupid to know who they're threatening." Snake Eyes wrenched his arm free from Maria's grip, nursing his wrist like a man who had touched a branding iron. "Just some half-breed widow. What's so special about her?" The old man's eyes found Maria's, and she saw something there that made her heart pound, not fear, but anticipation, as if he were waiting for her to remember something she had buried deep. "Tell them your father's name, granddaughter. Tell them why the Lakota called him a Puyalluta." Maria felt the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. Her father, Red Cloud, had been dead for 15 years now, but his legend lived on in the memories of both white soldiers and Lakota warriors. He had been the war chief who had forced the U.S. Army to abandon the Bozeman Trail, the only Indian leader to win a war against the United States government. But she had spent so long hiding that part of herself, trying to fit into Thomas's vision of peaceful coexistence, that she had almost forgotten the fire that burned in her blood. Jake Murdoch's laughter cut through the tension like a dull knife. "Red Cloud? That old devil's been dead longer than Carter's got pills. Even if she was his whelp, what's an Indian woman gonna do against 3 armed men? But as he spoke, more figures began emerging from the shadows. Native Americans who worked in the town, mixed bloods who had married into white families, even a few white settlers who had been helped by Thomas during the harsh winter 2 years back. They formed a loose circle around the confrontation, their presence transforming what had been a private humiliation into a very public challenge. Maria felt the change in herself like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for too long. She stepped away from the hitching post, her posture straightening, her chin lifting with a pride that came not from arrogance but from the deep well of her people's strength. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. My father was Mapia Luta, Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota. He was the war chief who made the Bluecoats run like rabbits from the Powder River country. He taught me to track, to hunt, to fight, and to lead. More importantly, he taught me to recognize cowards who prey on those they think are defenseless. The three outlaws exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their swagger for the first time. Morrison had told them this would be simple: frighten one isolated widow into selling her 160 acres so his cattle operation could expand. No one had mentioned anything about Red Cloud's daughter. Buck Travers tried to regain control of the situation. Even if that's true, which I doubt, your daddy ain't here to protect you now. Just us, you, and the choice about whether to sell that land peaceful-like or not. Maria reached into her dress and withdrew a leather-wrapped bundle that had been her father's gift to her on her wedding day. Inside the soft doeskin lay a knife that had drawn blood at the Battle of the 100 Slain, its bone handle worn smooth by her father's grip during countless battles. The blade seemed to drink in the afternoon light, its edge sharp enough to split a hair. My father gave me more than lessons in warfare, she said, turning the knife in her hands with casual familiarity. He gave me patience. The wisdom to know when to be the peaceful farmer's wife, and when to remember that I am the daughter of the chief who humbled Custer's army. Snake eyes back toward his horse, his earlier bravado evaporating like dew in the morning sun. This ain't over, squaw. Morrison ain't gonna take kindly to threats. This wasn't a threat, Maria replied, her voice steady as granite. This was an education. Tell Morrison that the land isn't for sale. Tell him that Maria Whitehorse protects what's hers. And tell him that if he sends boys to do a man's work again, he'll be burying them instead of paying them. As the three men mounted their horses with considerably less swagger than they had shown upon arrival, Joseph Two Eagles moved to stand beside Maria. The crowd of supporters remained, their presence a silent testament to the respect Thomas had earned in the community and the fear that Red Cloud's name still commanded even 15 years after his death. Your father would be proud, Joseph murmured in Lakota, his words meant for her ears alone. Maria watched the outlaws disappear in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, but her mind was already racing ahead to what would come next. Morrison was not a man who accepted defiance lightly, especially from someone he viewed as beneath his notice. The railroad had brought money and power to men like him, but it had also brought hunger for land and the ruthlessness to take it by any means necessary. As the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to offer quiet words of support, Maria found herself truly seeing her adoptive home for the first time in months. Willow Creek was a railroad town, built around the depot that connected this corner of Wyoming to the growing industrial might of the east. The main street ran parallel to the tracks, lined with businesses that served both the railroad and the surrounding ranches and farms. Morrison owned the largest spread in 3 counties, and his influence extended into every aspect of life in the territory. But there were cracks in his control, she realized. The mix of people who had stepped forward today, German immigrants, Irish railroad workers, Lakota and Arapaho who had found ways to survive in this new world, former slaves who had come west seeking freedom, represented a coalition that Morrison had never had to face before. Her husband Thomas had been building bridges between these communities without even realizing it, and his widow carried not only his legacy but her father's reputation. The late afternoon sun painted the wooden buildings in shades of gold and amber as Maria made her way back to the small farmhouse she and Thomas had built on their homestead 3 miles outside of town. The land was good, fertile bottomland along Willow Creek with enough water for crops and grazing. Thomas had chosen it carefully, knowing that their mixed heritage would require them to be more successful than their white neighbors to earn even grudging acceptance. The house itself was modest but solid, built from lumber milled at Morrison's own sawmill in a gesture that had seemed like acceptance at the time but now felt like a calculated investment. The barn was larger, designed to house not only their livestock but also to serve as a gathering place for the informal meetings Thomas had hosted, sessions where neighbors shared information about weather, prices, and the political changes that seemed to arrive with every train from Washington. As Maria fed the chickens and milked her small herd of dairy cows, her hands performed the familiar tasks while her mind wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. She could sell the land and leave Wyoming, perhaps returning to the reservation where her mother's sister still lived. She could stay and fight, using her father's reputation and her own considerable skills to protect what Thomas had built. Or she could try to find some middle path, some way to honor both her husband's dream of peaceful coexistence and her father's legacy of proud resistance. The decision might have been easier if she had been truly alone, but Thomas's death had revealed something she had not expected: she was carrying his child. The pregnancy was still early, barely showing, but it added a complexity to her situation that made every choice carry consequences for more than just herself. The child would be the grandchild of both Thomas Whitehorse, the peaceful farmer, and Red Cloud, the legendary war chief. In that combination lay either the promise of a new generation that could bridge two worlds, or the tragedy of a child torn between irreconcilable identities. As darkness settled over the prairie like a familiar blanket, Maria stood on her front porch and looked out across the land that she and Thomas had called home. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound carried her back to childhood evenings when her father would tell stories of the days before the iron horse carved its path across the sacred lands of her people. The confrontation today had been just the beginning, she knew. Morrison was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his next move would likely be more dangerous than sending 3 drunk outlaws to intimidate a supposed helpless widow. But as she touched the knife at her belt and felt the sacred pouch against her heart, Maria Whitehorse realized that she was no longer the grieving woman who had tried to disappear into her mourning clothes. She was Red Cloud's daughter, and it was time the territory remembered what that meant. The wind picked up across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of a storm building on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to her memories and her planning. Somewhere out there, Morrison was learning that his 3 men had failed in their simple task of frightening one Indian widow into submission. Soon, he would discover that some mistakes carry a price that no amount of money or influence can pay. 3 days after the confrontation on Main Street, Maria woke to the acrid smell of smoke drifting through her bedroom window. The gray light of dawn revealed what she had been expecting but hoping would never come: her wheat field, the one that would have provided winter feed for the livestock and income for the coming year, was nothing but blackened stubble stretching toward the horizon like a scar across the earth. She dressed quickly, her hands moving with the efficient calm that her father had taught her during the raids of her childhood. Panic was a luxury that warriors could not afford, and as she stepped onto her porch and surveyed the destruction, Maria felt the last vestiges of the peaceful farmer's wife burning away with her crops. Morrison had escalated beyond intimidation into open warfare, and wars had rules that civilization often forgot. The sound of approaching horses made her step back into the shadows of her doorway, her hand instinctively finding the knife at her belt. But the riders who emerged from the morning mist were not Morrison's men. Joseph Two Eagles rode in front, followed by a dozen others, some faces she recognized from town, others who had the weathered look of men who lived on the edges of civilization. What struck her most was their silence. These men rode with the quiet purpose of a war party, not the noisy bravado of outlaws. Joseph dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose bones had seen too many hard winters. The fire started near midnight. My grandson Samuel was watching Morrison's ranch last night. He saw riders leaving just before the flames began. A younger man, perhaps 30 years old with the mixed features that marked him as another child of two worlds, stepped forward. "I'm David Running Bear. My mother was Arapaho, my father a cavalry sergeant. I've been working for the railroad, but word is spreading about what happened in town. Morrison's pushed too far this time." Maria studied the faces of the men around her, recognizing something she had not seen since her father's war councils, the look of people who had reached the point where retreat was no longer an option. "What do you propose we do? The sheriff won't help us, and the territorial government takes its orders from men like Morrison. An older white man with the calloused hands of a working rancher spoke up. Name's Henry Mueller. Morrison's been trying to buy out small ranchers for 2 years now, using every dirty trick in the book. What he did to you crosses a line that decent folks can't ignore. He gestured toward the burned field. Fire doesn't ask if a man's skin is red, white, or any shade in between when it spreads. Joseph moved closer to Maria, his voice dropping to the private tone of family conversation. There's something else you need to know. Morrison didn't just burn your field to hurt you financially. Samuel overheard the men talking. They're planning to claim you set the fire yourself as part of some insurance scheme. Sheriff Collins is already preparing to arrest you for arson. The implications hit Maria like a physical blow. If she were arrested and imprisoned, the land would be forfeit, her unborn child would be born in a jail cell, and Morrison would have what he wanted without even the pretense of legal purchase. It was a trap that used the law itself as a weapon, turning her resistance into the very crime that would destroy her. David Running Bear pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. I've been doing some research at the Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne. Morrison's land acquisitions over the past 5 years follow a pattern. He identifies strategic parcels, usually those that control water rights or railroad access, then systematically drives out the owners through legal harassment, economic pressure, or outright violence. Maria unfolded the document and found herself looking at a hand-drawn map that showed Morrison's holdings in relation to the proposed route of a new railroad spur. Her land, she realized with growing understanding, sat directly in the path of the planned rail line. More than that, it controlled access to the best water source for 50 miles in any direction. Morrison wasn't just trying to expand his cattle operation, he was positioning himself to control the economic development of the entire region. How long before the sheriff comes? She asked, already knowing that her time as Maria Whitehorse, peaceful widow, was measured in hours rather than days. Collins was seen riding toward town this morning with a federal warrant, Henry Mueller replied. He'll be here by noon, most likely with enough men to make resistance look impossible. The circle of men waited for her response, their faces showing the kind of patience that came from understanding that some decisions could not be rushed. Maria found herself thinking of her father's words during the council meetings that had preceded the war for the Bozeman Trail. When the white chiefs make laws that say we must give up everything that makes us who we are, then those laws have no power over us. We choose our own path. I won't be arrested, Maria said, her voice carrying the quiet certainty that had marked Red Cloud's most important pronouncements. But I also won't run. This land belongs to my husband's memory and our unborn child. Morrison can't be allowed to steal it through tricks and false accusations. Joseph smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this moment since the confrontation in town. Then we follow the old ways. When the white man's law becomes the enemy of justice, we make our own law. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military campaign planned by men who understood both the landscape and their enemies' weaknesses. David Running Bear and 2 others rode hard toward Cheyenne, carrying documents that would expose Morrison's pattern of illegal land acquisition to territorial officials who were not yet in his pocket. Henry Mueller and several of the ranchers returned to their spreads to gather supplies and spread word to other settlers who had grievances against Morrison's empire. Maria herself began the transformation that would complete her journey from grieving widow to war leader. In the small root cellar beneath her house, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind sacks of winter potatoes, lay the war gear that her father had given her upon her marriage, not as a relic of a dead past, but as tools that might someday be needed. The beaded vest had turned aside an army bullet at Rosebud Creek. The war paint, made from clay and minerals sacred to the Oglala, carried the spiritual protection of 7 generations. The bow, crafted from Osage orange wood and backed with elk sinew, could drive an arrow through a pine board at 100 yards. As she painted the traditional lines across her cheekbones and forehead, Maria felt her father's presence as clearly as if he stood beside her. Red Cloud had won his war not through superior numbers or better weapons, but through superior understanding of his enemy's weaknesses. The U.S. Army had expected to fight a conventional war against an opponent who would meet them in open battle. Instead, they had faced an enemy who struck without warning and vanished like smoke, who knew every creek and canyon for 200 miles, and who understood that time and patience were weapons more powerful than rifles. Morrison had made the same mistake that the army had made 40 years earlier. He had assumed that his opponent would fight according to his rules, using his methods, accepting his definitions of victory and defeat. He had not considered that the daughter of Red Cloud might choose to fight as her father had fought, not as a citizen seeking redress through legal channels, but as a warrior defending her territory against invaders. By the time Sheriff Collins arrived with his warrant and his 6-man posse, the farmhouse stood empty except for a note pinned to the kitchen table, "Come and take it." The livestock had been driven off during the night, the valuable farm equipment had vanished, and even the chickens had disappeared as if the earth had simply swallowed everything of worth. Collins found tracks leading in a dozen different directions, some made by horses, others by people on foot, all carefully laid to confuse pursuit. What he did not find was any sign of the woman he had come to arrest or any evidence that could support Morrison's version of events. The burned wheat field showed clear signs that the fire had been set deliberately, but by someone who understood how to make flames spread in a specific pattern, not the random destruction that an inexperienced arsonist might create. 3 miles north of the farm, in a box canyon that had served as a hideout for Lakota war parties during the conflicts of the previous generation, Maria established the base of operations for what would become known throughout Wyoming Territory as the Willow Creek War. The canyon had water, grazing for horses, and defensive positions that could be held by a few people against a much larger force. More importantly, it had something that Morrison's money could not buy, the spiritual protection that came from fighting on land that her people considered sacred. The men who joined her there represented every group that Morrison's expansion had threatened or displaced. German and Irish immigrants who had been cheated out of land purchases. Mixed-blood families who existed in the margins between white and Indian society. Former slaves who had come west seeking freedom but found only different forms of oppression. Railroad workers who had seen too many of their friends die in preventable accidents because Morrison cut corners on safety to increase profits. What united them was not ideology or ethnicity, but the shared understanding that Morrison represented something larger than one man's greed. He was the embodiment of a system that promised prosperity and progress but delivered only for those with enough money and influence to write the rules in their favor. Against such a system, conventional resistance was useless. It was like trying to fight the wind with swords. The first strike came at dawn on the 4th day. Morrison's cattle, grazing peacefully on what had once been homestead land acquired through suspicious foreclosures, simply vanished overnight. No shots were fired, no violence was used, but 2,000 head of prime beef disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them. The cowboys who had been guarding the herd woke up to find their horses gone, their weapons missing, and themselves stranded 15 miles from the nearest settlement with nothing but a message written in charcoal on a flat rock: "Stolen land feeds no one." The missing cattle reappeared 3 days later in the yards of every small rancher, immigrant family, and Indian settlement within 50 miles of Willow Creek. The message was clear: what Morrison had taken through legal trickery and economic manipulation could be returned through methods that answered to a higher law than territorial statutes. Morrison's response was predictable but ineffective. He hired more gunmen, armed his ranch hands like soldiers, and petitioned the territorial governor for military assistance. But his hired guns found themselves fighting an enemy who was never where expected and always seemed to know their movements in advance. Ambushes failed because the targets had vanished before the attackers arrived. Night raids on suspected hideouts turned up nothing but empty camps with cold fire pits and mocking messages. The territorial authorities faced a problem that had no easy solution. Maria Whitehorse had committed no crime that could be proven in court. The cattle had been returned to their rightful owners, people who could produce homestead documents and bills of sale that predated Morrison's claims. The burned wheat field remained unsolved, with evidence pointing as easily toward Morrison's men as toward the woman they sought to arrest. Most troubling of all, the resistance enjoyed popular support from communities that normally had little in common beyond their shared resentment of Morrison's power. As autumn deepened into winter, the conflict evolved from a simple land dispute into something that threatened the entire structure of territorial authority. Maria had not simply disappeared into the wilderness, she had created an alternative system of justice that operated outside the control of men like Morrison and Collins. Disputes between neighbors were settled by councils that included both white and Indian representatives. Crimes against women and children were punished swiftly and memorably. Land claims were evaluated according to principles that considered not just legal documents but also the fairness of the original transactions and the needs of the broader community. The turning point came on a bitter December morning when Morrison made his final, fatal mistake. Frustrated by months of ineffective pursuit and escalating losses, he decided to strike directly at what he imagined was the source of his troubles. Acting on information provided by an informant who claimed to know Maria's location, he led a 20-man armed party into the sacred canyon, intending to end the resistance through overwhelming force. What Morrison found was not a camp of desperate refugees but a prepared battlefield where every rock and tree had been positioned to channel attackers into killing zones that offered no cover and no retreat. The informant, it turned out, had been feeding him false information for weeks, and the canyon he entered was not Maria's hideout but a carefully prepared trap that drew on 4 decades of tactical knowledge passed down from Red Cloud himself. The battle lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would reshape the politics of Wyoming Territory for the next generation. Morrison survived, but half his men did not, and those who returned to town carried stories of an enemy who fought with skills that no ordinary outlaw could possess. More importantly, they brought confirmation of what many had suspected but few had dared to say aloud: Maria Whitehorse was not just Red Cloud's daughter in name but had inherited his strategic genius along with his implacable will. In the aftermath of what newspapers would call the Battle of Sacred Canyon, territorial authorities finally grasped the full magnitude of what they faced. This was not a simple criminal matter that could be resolved through arrest warrants and court proceedings. They were dealing with an indigenous leader who commanded not just military respect but also the kind of moral authority that could unite disparate communities against common oppression. The resolution, when it came, reflected the pragmatic wisdom that had allowed American democracy to survive its first century of expansion and conflict. A territorial commission was established to investigate land ownership disputes in Morrison's holdings. Sheriff Collins was quietly transferred to a posting in eastern Wyoming where his particular talents would be less problematic. Morrison himself agreed to sell his questionable land acquisitions back to their original owners at fair prices, accepting the loss as preferable to the complete destruction of his empire. Maria Whitehorse emerged from the canyon in the spring, her pregnancy now visible, her reputation as a warrior secure, but her heart still mourning the husband who had dreamed of a different path to justice. The land she and Thomas had farmed became the site of a new settlement that welcomed families regardless of their heritage, a community that proved Thomas's vision of peaceful coexistence could work when supported by the strength to defend it against those who would destroy it for profit. She named her son Red Thomas Whitehorse, honoring both his grandfather who had fought to preserve the old ways and his father who had died believing in the possibility of new ones. In his mixed heritage lay the promise that future generations might finally find the balance between remembering the past and building a better tomorrow. The legend of Red Cloud's daughter became part of Wyoming Territory's oral history, passed down through families of every background as a reminder that justice delayed by those in power need not be justice denied forever. Some stories told of her supernatural powers, others of her tactical brilliance, but all agreed on the central truth: she had proved that one person, fighting for the right cause with the right allies, could still change the world. As the railroad spur was eventually built along a route that respected existing property rights rather than simply seizing whatever land was most convenient, Maria often stood on her porch in the evening and watched the trains carry passengers and freight toward distant destinations. The iron horse that had symbolized the destruction of her people's way of life had become, in its small way, a tool for building the kind of community that both her father and her husband would have approved of. The old ways and the new ways had found their balance at last, written in the blood and determination of a woman who had refused to let others define the terms of her surrender.